listener production.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing. Katrina Blowers here with you. Well, rents are rising in regional areas, and that means those towns and regions are no longer affordable to Australians who can't afford to pay big rents in cities. The other critical aspect of the problem is it's becoming more difficult for essential workers to afford to rent in regional centres. So these are people like teachers, nurses, police officers and aged care workers, essentially all the people that those areas need. Last week, recent data from CoreLogic revealed rent in 3/4 of Australia's biggest regional areas are now higher than ever, with WA and Queensland topping the list.
There was a big surge in migration to regional Australia because people became less tethered to CBDs through remote work.
The rural and regional rental problem, that is coming up in the second half of the briefing. But first, Helen Smith is here with the headlines. It is Thursday, June 6th.
Morning, Katrina. Well, we have some insight about the future of inflation from the RBA governor as Australia edges closer to a recession. Michelle Bullock told a Senate estimates hearing in Parliament House yesterday the federal government's $300 energy bill rebate is unlikely to have material impact on reducing inflation. But it's also unlikely to make it worse. So neutral, she thinks. The handout announced in the budget was a big talking point, with some questioning why all wealth brackets were receiving the help rather than a criteria to meet, and whether that extra money swishing around the economy would lead to more spending, which would then push inflation up.
Yeah, so Helen, all this comes as Australia's annual economic growth was revealed as 1.1%. Now, outside of the pandemic, this is the worst growth we've experienced as a country since the early 90s. Look in your history books, that's back when Paul Keating declared the recession we had to have. This now makes for a pretty fine tightrope for the Reserve Bank to be walking to avoid tipping the country into a recession if they raise interest rates again. Household spending is down, savings are down, business confidence is down, unemployment is rising, but inflation isn't coming down as fast as the Reserve would like. And Michelle Bullock also told that meeting yesterday that the Reserve would not hesitate to lift interest rates again if inflation starts to go up again. So that is pretty grim. One funny thing though, Helen, in looking at the economic activity for March is that Taylor Swift kind of saved the economy. I mean, the ABS singled out Swiftonomics as having a big boost on GDP data. So this is people buying tickets and merch for the Eras concert. Isn't it funny how things like that can have such a big impact? And the Grand Prix, which was held in Melbourne in March for the first time since 2019, was also listed as producing a boost to national economic activity. So yeah, thanks to all the people who went to the Grand Prix and thanks to Taylor Swift. The Albanese government and the opposition have condemned Greens members in Parliament for pro-Palestinian protests, accusing the party of inflaming tensions of social cohesion. So every Sunday around the nation, a large number of Aussies march in support of Gaza and Palestinians. This includes those university encampments and sit-ins at Parliament members' offices. And during question time yesterday, the PM and opposition leader accused the Greens of not taking strong enough action to condemn the behaviour of these protesters. Anthony Albanese said enough is enough and that the time for senators and members of Parliament to continue to attend and inflame tension outside these offices must end, adding that he has supported justice for Palestinians his whole life and he still does. Albanese also accused Greens MPs and senators of spreading misinformation about the war, including knowingly misrepresenting motions moved in the Parliament. Those are pretty big claims, Helen.
Yeah, they are. And Greens leader Adam Bandt, who was originally told he could not respond on a point of indulgence, later did say, quote, "This House is united in condemning anti-Semitism and condemning Islamophobia," end quote. And that he will not be lectured about peace and non-violence by people who back the invasion of Gaza. Victorians will now be able to report dodgy rentals with a new official complaint system backed by the state government. The Allen Labor government's $4 million renting task force has greenlit the project, with complaints filtering through to Consumer Affairs Victoria. And this will make it easier for renters to report properties that are below the rental minimum standard or that have been falsely advertised. So in Victoria, it is a criminal offence to allow tenants to move into a property that doesn't meet minimum standards. And if the Consumer Affairs finds the complaints to be true, landlords could face more than $11,000 in fines.
Yeah, so all this comes as the rental and housing crisis continues. I think we all know about that. Median rents across all of Australia have now hit a record high of $627 a week.
And the first British banknotes featuring the portrait of King Charles have entered circulation overnight. They'll be a rare sight, though, in the UK, with the central bank only releasing them one at a time to replace old, damaged notes coming out of circulation. And that was a request of King Charles himself, who was concerned about the environmental impact of the changing over of the notes.
Isn't that lovely of him? So thoughtful. And still in the UK, we brought you a briefing topic earlier this week about how bizarre the UK election is already. Well, it took a bit of another twist yesterday with an OnlyFans creator. I love how we know that bit of information, that this lady was an OnlyFans creator. She went viral after throwing a banana milkshake into the face of Nigel Farage. If you don't know who Nigel Farage is, he's the Conservative leader of the Reform UK party. He's pretty controversial and he was always going to make some waves, but how's this for strange? So he was walking around campaigning in Essex and this lady just out of nowhere throws this milkshake at him. And she was asked later why she did it. And she said, because I felt like it. I kind of think, you know, she's an OnlyFans creator. She's now gone viral, probably as the milkshake lady. I think there was a bit more strategy behind this, don't you, Helen, than just feeling like it in the moment?
Yeah, look, definitely. And hey, it's a pretty good PR marketing strategy if that is so. But this does make me actually think of the consent video that our government did with the milkshake a few years ago, where they threw the milkshake in the face trying to teach people about consent. So look, I think this milkshake throwing, it always creates waves and we always somehow take notice, so it works.
Oh my goodness, I forgot all about that. That is an excellent point. Well, perhaps that cringy video has gone a lot further than we thought and is now influencing real life. What a shocking thought. Helen, thanks so much for joining me for the headlines. We're now going to get into our briefing topic on rent rises in rural and regional Australia.
We often hear about the rental crisis in big Aussie cities, but rents across regional and rural Australia are also continuing to rise. So it means the promise of fleeing the high cost of living in a capital city and finding reprieve in the regions is actually fast evaporating. So rents in nearly every part of the country are hitting record highs. Real estate analysts at CoreLogic found rents in 3/4 of Australia's biggest regional areas are now higher than ever. Batemans Bay in New South Wales had the biggest increase over the past 3 months, with rents going up by 6%. And across the country, there wasn't a single major regional centre that recorded a significant fall in rental prices. So to explain what it means and what potentially could be done to address the problem more broadly, I'm joined by CoreLogic's Eliza Owen. Eliza, thanks for joining us. I want to start off by asking what it is that's driving up rents in regional areas and also how long we've been seeing this happening.
This is very much a kind of COVID effect that's been playing out over the past few years. We came off the back of the 2010s where average annual growth in regional rent values was only 2.1% a year. So that's pretty much in line with inflation. Through the early start of the COVID period, we saw, particularly in share housing, share houses kind of breaking up and people spreading out across the market, and because share houses tend to be renting households as well,
Yes.
this had a particular impact on the rental market. There was a big surge in migration to regional Australia because people became less tethered to CBDs through remote work. So that was kind of the first wave of growth in regional rents, where you go from very low average annual growth to a peak of 13.5% through the year to August 2021. And then growth in rents starts to taper off in the regions, but recently it's re-accelerated again. So it hit a low of about 3.5% annual growth at the end of 2022. And now, as of May 2024, it's back up to 7% annual growth. So I think why we're seeing the resurgence at the moment is partly because there's a new normal when it comes to living in regional Australia, as capital cities have continued to accelerate, and that acceleration in the capitals has come from net overseas migration spiking. A lot of those are renters, recent overseas arrivals.
And I'm assuming interest rates being passed on to renters as well?
Look, that might be part of it. The thing to remember about investment properties is that some people might own investment properties that don't even have debt on them.
Right.
So it's not just recuperating additional costs that some investors are facing. It's a matter of supply and demand. If you can put your rent up, you will, right, to get the higher income. Of course, I'm sure there are some individual exceptions out there, but as a general rule. So interest rates haven't really helped, and they haven't helped the supply side either, because investors are kind of wary of entering the market when interest rates are high and the returns from a property are lower. But through 2023, we've started to see this resurgence in rents that I think has also come from a re-acceleration in the capital cities. So migration data is showing a pickup again in movement from cities to regions. The premium on capital city rents has blown out again. So at a low, there was about $20 difference in beginning of 2022 of about $20 between the median rent in capital cities and regional Australia. That's blown back up to about $94 on weekly rents. So that could be pushing people back to the regions as well. And so all of those factors have culminated in this total increase in regional rents since the start of the pandemic of 38%.
Yeah, wow.
And that's the equivalent of median rents going from about $394 a week to $515 a week.
And are there any states that are worse affected by this regional increase?
It's a pretty broad-based uplift. Perth and WA are probably the worst because they were coming off a low base. But if we look at some of the regional areas, places like the Gold Coast and Wide Bay in Queensland have seen a 50% increase in rent values.
Is Gold Coast considered a regional area?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It's a major centre, but technically it's considered outside of the Brisbane boundary.
Right, okay.
But I guess Wide Bay would be a better example of a regional area in Queensland where rent values have gone up 50% since the start of the pandemic. So you're talking about hundreds of dollars a week that rents have increased.
So you've obviously mentioned the impact COVID has had, the increase in capital city rent as being some of the factors leading to this increase in regional rent. What about the impact of short-term accommodation, things like Airbnb and stays? Are they also, is there any evidence to suggest that they're pushing the rental prices up?
I think the evidence is quite mixed by region because there's not a lot of good, widely available data on it. But I think when you read about the impact on some regional areas, there's definitely been an effect from not having Airbnb homes utilised for longer-term rental accommodation. It's prompting a lot of investigation, reaction from Victoria and more recently the New South Wales government. And you know that you've got something wrong in your housing system when the tourists are staying in houses and the locals that service them in the industry are sleeping in tents. Right?
Yeah, something's not working.
Yeah, exactly. So there's been more investigation into short-term rental accommodation because homelessness is rising in regions, but in all of Australia. The rise in homelessness nationally is the result of a longer-term issue we have in this country of a decline in social and affordable housing as a part of our housing stock. So what that basically does is it means there's less of a barrier between the private rental market and homelessness. So when the private rental market becomes more competitive, that pushes people into more insecure housing at the lower end of the income spectrum. So Airbnb and short-term accommodation might play a part, but there's other longer-term issues at play as well.
You talk in the research about non-capital city significant urban areas, SUAs, and that 19 of those markets are at a record high. Is your research suggesting or finding any relief in sight?
In short, no.
Yeah.
I guess the only sign that I would see of an end in sight is, again, going back to the capital cities.
Yeah.
That's where we are seeing rent growth starting to taper off. And when that happens, that will eventually stem the flow of migration from capital cities to regions and people seeking more affordable rents in regions.
And are governments doing enough to help regional councils address the issue of more housing? Because often when we talk about housing supply, it's very city-centric.
There's a little bit of work going on in terms of investigation of short-term rentals in New South Wales that's come off the back of reports of increased homelessness in regional coastal towns. So my understanding is that submissions around short-term rentals and their impact on the housing market are being reviewed at the moment, and that's led by Housing Minister Rose Jackson. In Victoria, there's been a levy imposed on holiday homes of 7.5%. I mean, in economics, basically, when you want to stop people from doing something like having short-term rental accommodations,
You tax them or levy them, yeah.
Yeah, you make it more expensive to hold. And even if the holding costs are manageable for investors, the Victorian government has said that that revenue is going to go towards the development of social and affordable housing. So it's a start. I think ideally we would have some comprehensive data and analytics and research on exactly how short-term rentals are impacting the market, because it's probably not the only avenue we can look to improve the rental market.
I'm assuming that this has an impact at making it harder for essential workers to find a place to live in the regions, like nurses, police officers, teachers, aged care workers. I guess that's a bit of a double whammy of trying to attract those skills to the regions. And in some ways, it being more affordable was a bit of a draw card.
Yeah, it's a interesting one, because I would also argue that people get priced out of capital cities and look to major regional centres, which might be relatively affordable.
Right.
You know, I know people who are moving out of Sydney who are teachers and health workers, and because they can't afford to raise their family here. But at the same time, it does crowd out people who've been in those regional centres for longer, who are a part of that community, who are employed at local schools and hospitals as well. So it is something that's very disruptive when you get a big surge in housing values, whether it's purchase or rents, in a short period of time. And ideally, we have a large flow of social and affordable housing that kind of buffers those big extreme movements in housing prices.
So what more can be done to ease the pressure in the regions?
Again, I think because it is an issue where long-term factors like the decline in social and affordable housing development, you know, that's something that's taken a long time to get us here. So it's going to take us a long time to get out of it as well. People move quickly. Houses don't get built quickly, especially now where construction constraints are kind of elevated. So I think looking to the development of more social and affordable housing in regional Australia is always going to be a big part of it. Limiting the use of short-term stay accommodation into something that's more efficient and housing people, I think is probably a step in the right direction. But unfortunately, I think it's just going to be gritting our teeth and getting through this period of high inflation, strong pressures in the construction sector before we can deliver adequate housing.
Some pretty sobering insights there from CoreLogic's Eliza Owen, who is the head of research. She pointed out if we're hoping or looking for a quick fix or rental reprieve in the near future, that's unlikely to happen, because changes to building supply, housing supply, that's a long-term project. And of course, rental prices are putting a lot of pressure on Aussies already trying to cope with increases in energy bills, fuel, groceries, education and health. Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That is it for this morning. Before you go, though, we'd love if you could share this episode with someone you think might enjoy it. Oh, enjoy is a strange word, especially in light of this conversation, but might get something out of it or learn something from it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Antoinette Lattouf. Catch you next time.
Listener.